Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM.
Well, Kate, we're having a lot of last-minute changes here. All reporters were not expected to be invited to this address initially, just a few in the room, the pool, as we call it, coming in. And then just a few moments ago, the White House came over. The speaker announced that it was going to be open press, and they invited all of these reporters here. Now we are crammed inside the room, waiting on the president to deliver remarks at that podium behind me now, where we see there are two prompters flanking it, and the chairs appear to be filled with staff of the White House right now. But of course, the big question is is going to be, what is the president going to say about these attacks? We've been waiting on his response since last night. We know he's been huddling with his national security team in the Situation Room, weighing how he's going to respond. And it does appear that some of his allies on Capitol Hill are telegraphing what we could see in that response, if it's going to be a restrained response, despite the president for the last 5 days threatening that America will retaliate if Iran did strike Americans or American assets, as we saw them going after those bases where they are filled with Americans last night. But so far, Senator Lindsey Graham, other lawmakers who have spoken with the president have been saying that they believe he should act with restraint here, not respond to Iran in a proportionate manner to how they responded. So that's really going to be the big question of exactly what it is the president is going to say there, and really what is the overall mission for the Trump administration when it comes to Iran, because tensions are obviously considerably higher than they have been in the past. And so that is really going to be the question, not just what's the short-term response, what is President Trump going to do in the long term, Kate?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I spoke to Lindsey Graham just a short time ago, and he said, well, he doesn't know what the president's going to say. He does, when he spoke with him last night, he did think that the president thought that he had a good hand and that he was measured in his thinking. But of course, we wait to hear what the president has to say. Caitlin is in the room.
Yeah,
let me bring in Gloria. Go ahead, Caitlin.
One other thing I do want to note is last night, while we were waiting to see if we were going to hear from the president then, we are told by sources he was waiting to see if there were any American casualties in that attack. And we are told that is likely going to factor in the response you see from the president today.
That could be key. Very interesting. Caitlin, thank you so much. Our eyes remain there at the White House, waiting for the president. He will be speaking any moment now and addressing the nation. As we wait, Gloria Borger, let me bring you in. Gloria, what does this moment mean?
Well, I think it's a huge moment for the country and for Donald Trump. He has been saber-rattling against Iran for the last weeks, while his people have been talking now about a de-escalation. And I think it's a moment for the president to exhibit what Mitch McConnell this morning predicted he would exhibit, which are not qualities we have often seen from the president, which are patience and prudence is what Mitch McConnell is talking about. That's what Lindsey Graham is obviously talking about to you, Kate. And so we have to see a president up there who says, okay, now I want to de-escalate this, and I want to sit down with the Iranians, and I want to put an end to this. And we will see how he expresses that. And then we will see what the Iranians actually do. I mean, this may be the end of this for now, of course, but the question is, what happens down the road? Is this really the end as far as the Iranians are concerned? So it is a huge moment of leadership for the president. He should not be gloating, taking a victory lap, et cetera, but he ought to explain American policy. He ought to explain why he did what he did and clarify all of that, because, of course, there's been confusion about the strike itself. And then extend an olive branch and say, okay, enough is enough. We have no interest in going to war.
Barbara Starr, let's go over to the Pentagon right now, get the military view at this moment. Barbara, talk to me about some of what you're picking up, the early warnings that the military, the Pentagon was able to pick up that this attack, this retaliation from Iran was coming.
Well, that's right, Kate. By all accounts, no U.S. casualties. And one of the ways they may have been able to have that news of not having any U.S. casualties is the U.S. military and intelligence community was able to have very early warning on its own using military satellites, intelligence assets. They are able to see, using satellites that are obviously not aircraft flying in Iranian space, they can see the signature, the heat signal of these missiles inside Iran as they are being launched. And at that point, intelligence assets swing into action. They can begin to calculate what kind of missile it is, what its flight time, its trajectory is, and begin to calculate what some potential targets may be and where those missiles are headed. That is what happened when this launch began to take place. That is what helped the U.S. have its own intelligence and be able to warn U.S. troops very quickly to get into safe areas, and they were able to keep them out of harm's way. They also did get a warning from the Iraqi government that had heard from the Iranians, but still, it was U.S. intelligence, the U.S. military, that has these very highly classified systems that help them know when missiles are headed in their direction. It would be the same technology that would be used if North Korea, for example, was trying to launch a missile towards the United States. It's that critical, quick detection that a missile is in the air and it's coming your way. So this is really good news. I think we're about to see the President of the United States very shortly come into the room, and the world is waiting to see what he has to say.
That's exactly right, Barbara. John King, join us on this, because I want to get what you're expecting. This is an important moment for any president when he's making remarks like this. For this president, it will be very interesting, the tone that he takes.
It will be, Kate, and for the past 3 years there's been so much chaos, so much disruption, so much drama. It is hard sometimes to separate the big moments from the really big moments. This is an especially big moment for any president. This is a moment of war and peace. This is a moment of great consequence for this president of the United States. It is a moment in which he is battling he has to decide between his words of the last few days, in which he has said, if Iran strikes back at an American base or American personnel, you will pay a price for that. That the president's on the record saying, and against his own instincts. As a candidate and as a president, he has said, even though right now the math is going in the other direction, he has said he wants to withdraw the American military presence in the Middle East. So he has a big choice to make, and he has many audiences he's about to address. He has to address Iran directly. He has to address the American people. He has to address Iraq and the future presence of U.S. troops there at a time Iraq itself is in the middle of a mess here. He has to address American allies around the world who have long been opposed to his Iran policy, who are now wondering, do you have a strategy, or are you just in a tactical back and forth with the Iranians? One thing we do not get often from this president is nuance. And as Barbara and Gloria were just laying out, this is a moment where he has to lay out, if he does what we are told he is going to do, say, I am willing to step back if Iran starts behaving. I am willing to watch, and I'm even willing to negotiate. That is what we are told we will hear from the president. How does he lay that out, and can he lay it out, will he lay it out in a coherent way that not only gets us through today and tomorrow, but that charts some course, this is what the administration has failed to do so far, charts some course for where he hopes to get.
Jim Sciutto is here with me in studio. Jim, what are you thinking in this moment? You've been talking to your sources, but what are you thinking here?
The key questions today are, does the president believe Iran is now de-escalating? This is an opportunity. And is the president willing to de-escalate as well? Will he communicate that today? We learned something in these last 24, 48 hours. We learned that the U.S., that this president is willing to strike Iran in its most sensitive, high-level places. It killed a senior military intelligence leader and quite a political figure in Iran. That is a remarkable step for this president to take that prior presidents, Republican and Democrat, did not take because of fear of consequences. We also learned, though, that Iran can strike back at the U.S., and it does appear that they calibrated this intentionally. That's our reporting, not to hit U.S. soldiers, but they showed a capability here, and quite an accurate one. And they showed some of this before. Their attacks on the Saudi oil facility weeks ago showed enormous accuracy and advance in Iranian missiles. This attack on the U.S. bases from Iranian territory was, at a minimum, a message. Both sides have enormous capabilities. Are they willing at this point to walk back from the brink of war? That's a question the president has to answer.
Yeah, and the calibration that you just talked about, that is all of our reporting is as well, that the president is factoring that into his remarks. The fact that the casualties were American casualties were avoided here could be a key factor in what we're about to hear from the president. He will be speaking any moment now as we wait to hear from the president. David Sanger is here with me as well. David, the conversation of what de-escalation looks like, what does negotiation potentially look like with Iran in this moment? This is a conversation that has extended for a long period of time with you since the president decided to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. What are you listening for?
Well, what I'm listening to hear is openings to negotiation that are real. What we heard last year was, we're getting out of the deal, but you better stay and comply with it. That isn't sort of a way into negotiation. What we heard last year was, there are 12 things that Iran must do to change, and then we will talk to you. Also not a way usually to start conversations up. Now, Kate, I think the key moment will come if the president lays out a pathway to a real negotiation in which he indicates that the U.S. is going to have some flexibility and some give as well. Now, he did do this with North Korea. It's a much harder thing to do with Iran for all kinds of reasons, and I think it's much harder for his administration because Secretary Pompeo has been really the biggest single Iran hawk, and he's the one who's going to have to lead any real negotiations.
That's a really important and fascinating point, David, that you're absolutely right. Let me also bring in right now retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Layton. He once served as the Deputy Training Director at the National Security Agency. Great to see you. Tell me what you think is important in this moment. What is important for all military officers serving here and overseas that they'll be listening to when they listen to the Commander-in-Chief come to the lectern and speak in a moment?
Well, Kate, the big thing that they're listening for is what's next. What's the direction that's going to come up for a military officer, for military enlisted folks? Are they going to be deployed for years on end in an endless war that we've sworn to get out of? Or is this something that with proper vigilance we can contain? So we're basically at the nexus between an active military campaign and a containment strategy of one type or another. So those are the things that we're looking at. We're looking at, what the impact will be on military families, what the impact will also be on the force itself, because this kind of an ops tempo, an operational tempo that the force has sustained since basically 9/11 is a very, very tough thing for a force to sustain during this period. And that's really a key question. Can we do this if we go really hot war with Iran? Or can we step back and contain this in a way that allows us to protect our forces, but also the interests of our allies?
Let me get over to Christiane Amanpour, CNN's chief international anchor, of course. Christiane, what is next, do you believe, from Iran's perspective here?
Well, look, I think everything you've just been talking about is absolutely correct, that Iran sent a message. It was the first time Iran has directly launched missiles at an American target from inside its country and claiming it, not saying this is anonymous or not just, doing something and saying it wasn't us, saying it was us. The words of the Supreme Leader, this is a slap in the face of the United States. But I think the real thing to know now is whether, as Secretary Esper said to me yesterday, the U.S. wants to make sure this is a moment of deterrence and a moment, as he said, to get Iran to sit down with us and talk about a better future. So how is that going to happen? Because if the United States continues its policy of maximum pressure, i.e. not just pulling out of the nuclear agreement, but the very harsh sanctions that strangle Iran's oil capacity and all its economic capacities, if that continues, intelligence believes that Iran will eventually continue what it's been doing, and that is responding with those little attacks, well, those attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf, the attack on the Saudis, all those things that it's done that led to this point. Furthermore, Iran has said even this proportionate response is not our final aim. Our final political aim is to get the U.S. forces out of the region. I think one has to really focus on that. That is coalescing as the message out of Iran since this whole cycle began, and certainly by the words of the leaders since this retaliatory strike. And what does that mean, and what does it look like? Because the U.S. does not want to leave Iraq. Iraq's U.S. allies do not want to be abandoned and left in the region without the United States. And if the U.S. does have to leave Iraq somehow or some way or somewhen, it'll be Iran and indeed Russia, according to the sources, who are the winners. So Iran has a political strategy which it's had for a long time, and now it's up to the United States to formulate a political strategy. Secretary Pompeo said yesterday the strategy is confront and contain. Those appear to be conflicting aims. How do you confront and contain? You generally, according to experts, do one or the other. So I think it's absolutely necessary to know whether the U.S. has a strategy going forward, and what it is.
So the stakes for what the president is about to say are only getting greater as you lay out there, Christiane. Please stick with me. Let's go to Tehran right now. That is where Frederick Pleichen has been since the beginning of all of this. Fred, what are you hearing there? What is the expectation on the ground in Tehran? How important are these remarks there tonight?
Well, they're extremely important because the Iranians are looking to see whether or not the retaliatory strikes that they conducted, whether or not that's going to be the end of it. And really what we've been hearing here on the ground, Poppy, from pretty much every Iranian military and political official that we've been speaking to, is they've been saying, look, after you've killed our main general, Qasem Soleimani, we are going to retaliate. We're going to have to retaliate, and we're going to retaliate against military targets. After that retaliation took place, it was quite interesting to see how quickly Iranian officials then came out and are now offering, I think, what Jim was calling an off-ramp for all of this. First and foremost, you had Iran's foreign minister, who's, of course, someone who's very vocal and often is the face, really, of Iranian public diplomacy towards the world. I want to read in just a little bit of the tweet that he sent really very shortly after these strikes took place. He said, Iran took and concluded, and I think concluded is really a key word in all this, proportionate measures in self-defense under Article 51 of UN Charter, targeting base from which cowardly armed attack against our citizens and senior officials were launched. So the Iranians are saying this is absolutely proportionate in their mind after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, because they struck the base from there where they believe that this attack on Qasem Soleimani was launched, and they also believe that now those measures are over. It seems as though from them saying that these measures have been concluded. Now, the Iranians are saying that the ball very much squarely is in President Trump's court moving forward. Christian was just saying it, and I think it's one of the key things actually that's playing out here on the ground in Iran as well. If you spoke to people, we've seen some folks on the ground as well, the supreme leader coming out and saying this was nothing more than a slap in the face towards the Americans. That seems to confirm that the Iranians were not looking to kill American troops. It looks as though the Iranians were trying to demonstrate that they have these capabilities, what Jim was talking about, that they can strike pretty accurately with these ballistic missiles. And we've been hearing a lot about Iran's ballistic missile program. They've obviously been talking about it a lot as well. It is still quite remarkable to see that these missiles seem to have been fairly accurate in the way that they were steered towards those two bases that had American troops on them. I think that's something where the Iranians really demonstrated that their capabilities are quite menacing if that's what they want them to be. So the Iranians clearly have demonstrated that capability to the U.S. They're now saying, look, how you move forward is really up to you. If you don't strike back at us now, and this is something that the Iranians have said, then it can end here. If you do, then this will descend a great deal further. One senior Iranian general coming out and saying that if the U.S. does strike back, that there would be what he calls an even more crushing response, and that obviously could have devastating consequences, not just for Iran itself and for the United States, but of course also for this entire region as well. But I do think that for the Iranians, it was extremely important for them to show that in this conflict that it has with the United States, in this very long-term conflict, they don't just rely on low-tech proxy forces if they want to threaten U.S. interests. They can do it with very conventional equipment that they have, that they produce themselves and still be extremely dangerous with it. And one final thing that I think is really important as well is one of the things that Christian was saying, is that for the Iranians, the big conflict with the Trump administration, the conflict that we're seeing play out right now, for them, that started with the United States leaving the nuclear agreement. I was speaking to the Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif yesterday, and he was telling me, look, it looked as though things were moving forward in the Middle Eastern region. There were good things happening. There were good things happening, he said, in Iran as well. And then he asked me, what happened? And he said, in his mind, it was the United States leaving that nuclear agreement and starting the maximum pressure campaign, which, of course, the Iranians refer to as economic terrorism in their mind, because, of course, it has really crippled this country's economy. It's doing a lot of damage, a lot of goods not available. The medical sector, by the way, suffering as well. And if you look at the sort of escalation that we've had since then, it really is quite remarkable, because then all of a sudden you had attacks on tankers in the Persian Gulf. That seemed like a big standoff between the U.S. and Iran, where things got dangerously close to escalating. Then you had those attacks on those oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, the shoot down of an American drone, and now you have these two sides shooting directly at one another, with an Iranian general being taken out, and then on the other side now the Iranians conducting these missile strikes. The big question is, how can that fundamental nucleus of the escalation that's going on, how can that be addressed and some sort of agreement be found between these two sides, guys?
Fred, thanks so much. All right, let's go to Riyadh really quickly. Nick Robertson is standing by. Nick, what could, of course, we wait to hear from the president. He will be speaking any moment now. What could his remarks, this statement, this moment mean for U.S. allies in the region?
They could be quite huge. I mean, to that point of what happens next, if this is a military de-escalation off-ramp towards diplomacy, if President Trump is going to interpret it as such, it's clear what he wants, the 12 points that David Sanger was talking about, including, biggest of all, of course, the denuclearization of Iran, longer clauses on the sunsets of when they can get back to some of their greater levels of production, controls of ballistic missiles, things that Iran has refused to do under these maximum pressure sanctions. But it's very clear what Iran's position is now, and that is U.S. troops out of the region. So is President Trump prepared to put that on the table as part of the negotiations, that U.S. troops would pull out of Iraq? And that is what U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates are going to look at. Is the United States, is President Trump really going to roll back effectively over the longer term U.S. interests in the region? And therefore, what might happen? Would Russia come in? Would China come in? So allies right now are going to look very carefully at how they can interpret if there is a compromise emerging in the president's mind here, that he can get into a dialogue with the Iranians, that this is an appropriate moment, and that he can put on the table the thing that it appears the Iranians want the most, which is U.S. troops out of the region. Of course, they want sanctions lifted as well, and the president wasn't prepared to put those on the table to negotiate with the Iranians before. But this is what allies here in Saudi and elsewhere will be looking for.
Nick, thanks so much. All right, we're going to get a quick break. We're not going to miss a moment of the president's remarks to the nation and the world. We'll be right back.
Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM. Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM. Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM.
Nous tous dans Atlanta, invités par Johnny C. Productions pour venir fêter le CEO Johnny Charleston qui a célébré son 45e anniversaire dans une superbe soirée de gala samedi 18 janvier 2020 dans Atlanta Event Hall. Artiste solo invité Annie Alert, orchestre sur le podium, cadence de jus de Jean et le tabou combo Superstars. Avec nous t'es commencé. Maître de cérémonie Whoopi the Entertainer, live et TV streaming avec Whoopi Production Television, DJ Final pour l'intermède musical. Samedi 18 janvier 2020, rendez-vous dans Atlanta Event Hall, dans 3750 Venture Drive, Duluth, Georgia. Ouverture des portes 8h30 du soir, showtime 10h du soir. Admission $30. Pour VIP, réservation de table et bouteilles, relais 404 901 15 11, 404 901 15 11, ou bien visitez Johnny Productions, LLC.com.
Dans la fraternité, nous partons. Papa Léo connaît. Si gen yon restaurant haïtien qui respecte normes internationales dans USA, li pa l'autre que Cuisine La Caille Plus. Qui bla école dans 1672 Blue Hill Avenue Matapen. Toute prestation train dans Matapen Square. Yon bel espace propre, sécurisé, climatisé. Depuis sous nom Cuisine La Caille Plus, nous déjà ouais manger yo bon, c'est coupé douette, bouillon tête cabrit, du riz ak jonjon, pitimi, blé, maïs moulin, du riz collé, sauce pois, légumes, lambi, bon banane. Moi connais un pile nan nous te perdu goût bouche nous, mais grâce à Cuisine La Caille Plus, tout problème résout. Si l'ami, pas faire négligence, suspend manger tente k'ap ban nou acide. Koui algérie votre nous dans Cuisine La Caille Plus. Téléphone 857 267 48 67.
Le son pur, c'est sur Radio Pure FM.
His way, and a lot of things that the foreign policy establishment, the political establishment, find outside the norm, find outside any way things should be conducted. The president says, that's my way and I'm going to do it. At the White House today, what they are saying is if Iran is really ready to de-escalate, then they win, that they took a horrible terrorist off the battlefield and Iran fired missiles into the ground. That they consider this a win. The question is, what does the president want to do next? And you're right about the strategy. There's also the moment, as we wait for the president to come through those doors. These are disconnected events in some ways, but everything is connected in another way, given the calendar. This is a president who's about to face an impeachment trial, who's now standing at a moment of war and peace, who's 300 days away from the next presidential election, in which he is seeking 4 more years as commander-in-chief and leading the country. So those things, you can view them as separate, or as the president walks into this room, he understands the calendar, he understands the other things that are happening as he faces a moment here of great testing.
Let's go into the room. Once again, Caitlin Collins has been standing by. Caitlin, the announcement from the White House was that the president would be speaking at 11 o'clock on the dot. As we well know, it is far past that at this point. Is there a reason for the delay?
Well, it appears they may be changing the remarks. About 15 minutes ago, an aide came in, removed a small, thin binder from the lectern where the president is going to come in just a few moments now, and they just brought it back a few moments ago, typically a sign that the president is likely on his way. Now, aides to his top national security advisors are here in the room, but those national security advisors are not in here yet. But, Kate, if you see now, the defense secretary is coming in, the vice president is coming in, other officials are coming in now right behind us, and we are just waiting on President Trump himself to join us here in the room.
Yeah, you can see, as Caitlin can see, she is right there, and as we are all watching. Jim Sciutto, what this says as we wait for the president is this is a show of force.
Absolutely. That
is going to be standing beside, behind, and with President Trump when he comes out.
And a show of unity, frankly.
Yeah.
We're all on the same page. We agree. You know, there have been very public cases of differences between the president and his senior advisors, the intelligence agencies, the Defense Department, etc. Think of the Syria withdrawals, I should say, plural. But in this case, clearly looking to deliver a message that this is a unified group making this decision for the country.
Can we all just note the utter and complete silence coming from the room as they walk in? Gloria, it is remarkable to see. This shows the weight of this moment.
Well, it does, and it shows you that they all understand the weight of this moment. And it is a moment when a president can, to state the obvious, behave like a president, and when he can show that he has a clear and concise policy, and here he is.
And here we have President of the United States to address the nation and the world.
As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region. He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American, and he orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood. He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013, and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. We must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
That the world was waiting to hear from the President of the United States. Gloria Borger, let me bring you in. What's your reaction?
Well, my reaction to this is, first of all, that the President made it very clear that he intends to continue and invoke more economic sanctions against Iran. This was not a call for negotiation. This was a president who believes he is dealing from strength and said, we are going to double down here to a great degree. I think it was interesting that you saw all the generals arrayed behind him during this kind of a speech. We do not see that when the president delivers what is considered a political speech to the nation, but they were standing there, and we have not seen that in the past. One other thing I also want to point out is the president blaming Barack Obama for all of this, saying that as a result of the Iran nuclear agreement, this is something he has said in the past over and over again, that they went on a spending spree, as he called it, which was funded by money that they obtained from the United States through this deal. And as we all know, after multiple fact checks over and over and over again, this is Iranian money that was unfrozen as a part of the negotiation. So I think what you saw was a president who was resolute, but not saying, let's talk. What he was saying is, we are continuing to apply maximum pressure, and he didn't acknowledge anything that the Iranians may have done in their proportionate response. And so I think this is a president who wants to let the American public know that he is dealing from strength, that he is completely unbowed, and that he is continuing to twist the knot here against the Iranians.
Jim, what did you hear?
Listen, I think it is true that the president feels he's dealing from a position of strength, but with respect, I'll disagree with Gloria because I found it notable that the final words in the president's speech to the people of Iran, the U.S. is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. It's not unlike President Obama's famous unclenched fist speech, which led over a number of years to negotiations with Iran and eventually the nuclear deal. And the president advertised what a potential negotiation could yield for Iran in similar terms to the way he's advertised it for North Korea, saying that this will unleash great economic opportunity for you and your people. It sounded to me like the president was at least, again, in the midst of a larger message of strength, and we got the world's worst terrorist. He's talking about the killing of Soleimani and so on. He called the world's top terrorist, reiterating his willingness to sit down at the table, again, on America's terms, but to embrace peace with all who seek it. I don't think that's an insignificant statement from the president, insignificant statement from him.
A little of something for maybe everyone in that. Let's go back to the room. Caitlin Collins was in there. Caitlin Collins, what'd you hear?
I think now Iran is in a weakened position.
Well, Kate, it was really notable that the president came out here. Before he even greeted the room, he said, and I'm quoting him now, "As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon." Then he greeted the room and got into those remarks, talked about essentially what the response to that is going to be. He signaled it is not going to be a military response, though you saw him flanked by the Defense Secretary, the Vice President Mike Pence, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff here in the room. A show of force and military might, of course, but the president said instead he is going to impose more sanctions, more economic sanctions on Iran, though he didn't elaborate what those sanctions are going to look like. He also said he's going to ask NATO to get more involved in the Middle East, though there are still questions about what the president exactly meant by that. But, Kate, it was a really notable, the president saying we do have this military equipment, but we don't always have to use it. That is not what you've heard from the president over the last 5 days when he was telling Iran, essentially threatening them that if they did retaliate against Americans or American assets, that he would respond with that military equipment, he said, and rather quickly. Another thing that was really notable is the president credited the fact that no lives were lost in those attacks last night, whether American or Iraqi. But one thing he talked about that, and it's interesting noting what administration officials were telling Jim and I earlier about whether they thought Iran purposefully missed those Americans. The president credited an early warning system for that. And we know that, of course, the Iraqi government gave those air bases a heads up about this attack, and that potentially was what the president was referring to there, saying that that is what helped here save lives. So, of course, the question going forward and the question that didn't get answered is what is the long-term strategy going to be coming out of this? Is the president still willing to meet with Iran's president as he was over the summer? And, of course, his big remark that he's made that Iran is a changed country since he took office. The question is, how is that the case since you have continued to see these tensions between the two countries escalate?
Caitlin, to your point about what is the long-term strategy that the president did or did not lay out, let me get back over to Christiane Amanpour for that. Christiane, what's your take?
Well, to amplify what you've just been talking about, I would say his statement that he was going to be talking to NATO leadership tonight, asking them to get more involved in the Middle East, is perhaps the most significant takeaway, because he then went on to say, we don't need Middle Eastern oil. So is this a tacit indication that the United States wants to hand over military care of that region to NATO? And if so, isn't that exactly what Iran wants? This is going to be very confusing, and we really, really need to know what exactly the president meant by that. Is he signaling a acceleration of the withdrawal of the U.S. presence from that region? The Saudi Arabians are not going to like it. The Persian Gulf states are not going to like it. And Iraq is going to be in a very, very difficult place if that happens. It is, however, what I said today, the united voice coming out of the Iranian leadership, that this military strike, which the president described as Iran standing down. This military retaliation from Iran was a slap in the face, but their long-term goal, and that is their strategic political goal, is to get U.S. to reduce and pull out its forces from that region. So this is a story we're going to have to watch very, very closely. On the other hand, I would say the president categorically held out the possibility of a deal with Iran. He actually said it. He used those words, that he's going to ask Iran to come back, and he's going to ask his European allies to pull out of the nuclear deal so that everyone can get together and negotiate a new deal. And then he went on to say, which is quite extraordinary, that the true fact that ISIS is also a threat to Iran, and that the United States and Iran should actually work together to combat ISIS. Well, that is precisely what Iran did at the very beginning. It stepped in before there was any U.S. presence or any coalition against ISIS, stepped in to fight ISIS on the ground in Iraq and then in Syria. And in fact, President Rouhani's tweet today was, General Soleimani fought heroically against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. If it weren't for his war on terror, European capitals would be in great danger now. And then he added, our final answer to his assassination will be to kick off U.S. forces out of the region. So those are the really interesting and important points. And again, as I said, if maximum pressure continues, you know, there's a lot of conflicting strategies or tactics being promoted by the president there. And we'll see, you know, which way they go. But if maximum pressure continues, you're likely to see maximum response from Iran.
With new economic sanctions that he says are going to be immediately imposed, as now it's maximum pressure plus some. Christian, stand by if you could. Let me get back over to the Pentagon from the military perspective on this. Barbara Starr is there. Barbara, the president mentioned military equipment, the capability of the U.S. military quite extensively in his remarks. What are you hearing about this?
Well, I think it is extraordinary that he, for the first time I can remember, in detail recently said about all this U.S. military equipment he likes to call big, beautiful equipment. We don't have to use it. We don't want to use it. He is signaling that he understands perhaps now the notion of going to war, going into combat against Iran is a catastrophic possibility. He has been briefed by the Pentagon, we know this, about what war with Iran would look like. It would be extremely difficult. Iran is a massive country with dispersed weaponry, air defenses, very tough for the U.S. to get in there. And what would they do? Would they, you know, have regime change? What would the end game be? What would the goal be of any U.S. military operation in a significant way against Iran? The Pentagon has long had the view this would be very tough. So that is a critical military message that the president today gave to the Iranians, to the U.S. military, and to Americans and to American military families, again, that he is not looking to go to war. I think the other military message he had, right at the very beginning, you heard him talk about one of the successes last night was the early warning that the U.S. had. You know, yes, they were warned by the Iraqis this might be coming, but we know now that U.S. satellites, radars, U.S. intelligence systems were able to very quickly detect that a missile launch had happened. They were able to calculate where they thought these missiles were headed. We know not all the missiles made it to the targets, so the Iranians clearly had some problems with what they were doing. That may be an indication that they were actually using some of their older missiles, their less capable missiles, but the U.S. was able to detect, and this gave the U.S. enough time to get troops to safe areas. Very quick last point. The president is addressing the Iranian regime, but those Iranian-supported proxies, militias, those commanders out in the field, whether the regime is able now, with a new leader, with Soleimani dead, whether they can even control those people is very much an open question. Dealing with just the regime may not be enough. Kate?
Yeah, that is a key point to keep in mind as things move forward in what are still intensely uncertain times. Barbara, thank you so much. Let's get the view from the region right now. We are correspondents fanned out in Tehran, in Baghdad. Let's go to Tehran right now. Fred Plaikin there. Fred, how are these remarks likely to be received there?
Well, I think they're going to be received quite well by part of the Iranian political leadership. What we had, for instance, in the last time that these two sides came very close to a shooting war against one another, which of course was when the Iranians shot down a U.S. drone over the Persian Gulf. When the president at that point in time decided not to retaliate, the country's foreign minister, Jawad Zarif, came out and said that that was a wise decision. And I think the Iranians, with their strike, their retaliation that they conducted this time, I think that this is pretty much exactly the outcome that they would have wanted to see. They are essentially will be saying that one of their generals was hit, one of their top generals was hit. They struck back, and in the end, that's where it was left off. This did not lead to a larger escalation. We've heard it over the past couple of days from several top Iranian officials that they don't want this to escalate any further. I talked to a senior commander, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader, who said there's going to be a proportionate response. We expect the Americans to, at that point, let it be. Don't strike back any further at us. Of course, as Christian says, though, this does not eliminate the fundamental issue between these two sides, and that is the nuclear agreement. And I think that a lot of Iranian leaders, Jawad Zarif, the foreign minister, the president of Iran, they sort of believe that the president is a little bit obsessed with the JCPOA, with the nuclear agreement, because obviously he's so critical of the Obama administration. The Iranians continue to point out the fact that the U.S. was probably in a much better place when it was still adhering to the nuclear agreement, because Iran was fairly transparent about its nuclear programs. There were inspectors coming into Iran's nuclear facilities. There were less centrifuges at work, and the Iranians had caps on the amount of uranium they would enrich and the levels that they would enrich them to. If you look at what's been going on here over the past couple of days, the Iranians have just announced their fifth step of diminishing their compliance with the nuclear agreement, now saying there's no more limits on the amount of centrifuges that they're allowed to have, and also on the amount of uranium enrichment and the level of uranium enrichment as well. And so the Iranians are saying, look, is the U.S. really better off now? Is the U.S. really safer now that the nuclear agreement is essentially being hollowed out? So from that vantage point, that fundamental issue, the sanctions, the nuclear agreement, that has not been solved. And so the situation probably will continue to be dangerous here in the Middle East going forward, Poppy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. David, I'm really curious. After hearing the president's remarks, what is your big takeaway?
Well, I think this was the sound of muddled policy. There was a little bit for everybody in it. There was the holding open of the possibility of having some kind of conversation, as Jim pointed out. But at the same time, he said, we're going to double down on sanctions. Well, it was the doubling down on sanctions that started this whole cycle to begin with. One alternative path he could have taken would be a temporary lifting of sanctions in return for the Iranians reimposing those constraints on the nuclear program that we were just hearing about from Frederick. That would be how you get a conversation going. Maybe it's possible that that's what he's sending Secretary Pompeo or others off to do, or try this through some third parties, or something similar to it. I think the risk in the president's position right now is that while he has said he is open to negotiation, he hasn't yet laid out a pathway of how you get from here to there. And that's
here to the table.
Here to the table. And that's been the problem all along, that the rhetoric, the Iran deal was so terrible and so forth, has made the Iranians wonder whether they can negotiate with him at all, or just try to stick it out until the election. And that's the risk.
And put the president putting himself in a corner in terms of his rhetoric with regard to the Iranian deal all along.
That's right. So I'm not sure he fully picked up on the signal of today, which was, we're going to do something back, we're going to conclude it, now what's your next move? Unless he's trying to do that through back channels.
Which must remain, as we know, a possibility. I'm going to get more of the military view and reaction and what this means now. Let me bring in retired Major General James Spider Marks, of course, a CNN military analyst. Spider, what did you hear here?
Well, primarily, what I heard from the president was at the very end, and Jim Sciutto touched on it, was at least the start of a strategy. The discussion in advance of that was a number of tactical opportunities and steps and things that have been done that could contribute to a strategy. And the strategy really is, how do you achieve a peaceful Iran where globally it can interact and other nations can be engaged with Iran? That's what I heard at the very end. So I thought from that perspective, it was As David said, it was a little bit muddled, but it was a bunch of tactical stuff. But at the very end, hey, let's try to have a relationship. This gets far beyond economic sanctions exclusively, which is a part of a list of things that the United States is doing either independently and with partners to try to get Iran to change its behavior. That's the key thing. Iran has to modify its behavior. We're not going to sit there and offer openings and offer quid pro quo. I mean, we're not going to offer anything without a quid pro quo. Sadly, that term has all Ukrainian stuff hanging off of it. But the issue is, Iran's got to modify its behavior. So from my perspective, if Iran can do that, now there's a great opening for the United States to maintain a presence and influence in a region. It can change what that looks like, but the United States is not going to walk away from the region. The big concern is Saudi Arabia and Iran without the United States or NATO.
And there is a lot to digest here. The President of the United States, in his remarks to the country, to military serving overseas, and to the world, quite frankly, as we're seeing in our discussion after the fact, there's going to be a lot of consequence and fallout from it. Stay with CNN for much more coverage on the escalating crisis with Iran and what the President's remarks mean for the immediate and long-term future, if there is a relationship there. John King in Inside Politics picks up on this.
Un son qui résonne dans vos tympans. Le son pur de Radio Pure FM.